So our group is going to talk about the topic measuring inequality, and first we're gonna make a little introduction. So macroeconomists and policymakers use different criteria to assess the output and interaction of different economic factors. Moreover, by understanding the data, they can implement measures to run the economy in the best possible manner. However, they must adapt to different standards or criteria such as efficiency and fairness. The problem lies with the fact that the most efficient manner of operating the economy could not meet the standards of fairness and vice versa. The efficient operation of the market might create social damages such as inequalities. An example of this is the wealth distribution rate, where 10% of the population worldwide owns more than 85% of the total wealth. In this report, we'll be explaining and comparing the different inequalities. We'll first focus on the income inequality, taking as reference two European countries, which are Spain and France. To make the comparison, we will look at their Lorenz curves and Gini coefficient. And just to explain a bit, the Lorenz curve is a graphical representation of income inequality, and the Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality, which varies or gives you a range from 0 to 1. Moreover, we will continue by looking at other countries such as Germany and India to give a broader perspective of income inequalities in different countries. And secondly, we will measure other inequalities such as life expectancy, health and gender, and therefore to establish different relationships amongst them.
In macroeconomics, the Lorenz curve is a graphical representation of the distribution of income, which was developed by Max O. Lorenz in 1905 for representing inequality of the wealth distribution. For our exercise, we are set to create a Lorenz curve for both Spain and France, so that it can help us with our analysis of the country itself when it comes to inequality, as well as to compare between the two of them. When it comes to Spain, at a first glance, we can see that not much has changed in terms of income distribution. It is clear to us that both curves are found to be distant from the perfect equality line, and they are also draw a very similar parable. However, it is important to point out that we do find some sort of increase reflected in the graph between 1980 and 2014 line, which is also seen as a gap. Such a gap appears in the first decile and continues on till the seventh decile, approximately, showing how some change in the income distribution has occurred in the country. Moreover, in France, our deduction is a little bit different. Here, both lines are almost identical until they reach the fourth decile approximately, where we see that the gap starts to grow and pushes the lines apart. When we arrive to the eighth or ninth decile, the gap reaches its maximum, and so it starts to decrease. In general, we can say that the distribution of inequality in France has worsened between these years. Moreover, we go on to analyzing specifically 1980 and 2014 in the two countries, so we are able to give you a more extensive analysis.
Gini coefficient is a measure of statistical dispersion intended to represent the income inequality or wealth inequality within a nation or a group of people. If the Gini coefficient is below 0.2, it represents perfect income equality. If it's between 0.2 and 0.3, it represents relative equality. If it's between 0.3 and 0.4, it represents adequate inequality. If it's between 0.5 and 0.4, it represents big income gap. And if it is between above 0.5, it represents severe income gap. Regarding the two countries that we have just studied, we can observe that in Spain we have similar Gini coefficients in 1980 and in 2014. They are both above 0.4, and this means that inequality has not suffered a lot of transformations during those 30 years. In France, it's the same case. So we have similar Gini coefficients, and it's important to mention that both countries have Gini coefficients which are above 0.4, which means that they have a big income gap. The problem with Gini coefficient is that its information might sometimes be too vague, and that is why it is important to use ratio measures that compare different deciles of the population, such as the 90-10 ratio, which compares the top decile with the lowest decile, and also the 90-50 ratio, which compares the share of income that the top decile has with respect to the average. Macroeconomists might want to use them because they will get a deeper and better insight about inequality along with the measures of the Gini coefficient, so that the research is more complete.
In German, the earning dispersion is a measure that compares the income of the top 10% with the median in order to assess how income is distributed between the 5th and the 10th decile of the population. If we look at the data from 2014, earning dispersion is equal to 121.8. Therefore, the top decile receives 81.8% more than the median, which reflects a big gap between the median and the high income class. Regarding the overall income inequality, these measures uses the Gini coefficients, and in 2012, as we can see, the overall income inequality was equal to 28.8%. Since 1990 has been an increasing trend in this figure leading to higher inequality, reaching a value of about 28%. Regarding the poverty, as for this measure, we can observe in the chart that historically the curve has had some ups and downs during the year. However, it is interesting to see how, again, since 1990, the percent of people below the 60% line dramatically increased, reaching values of approximately 14%. Additionally, since the year 2000, it has been quite stable, with the exception of the year 2009, in which financial crisis shocked the whole world, leading to an increase in this value. Now we're going to be talking about the top income share. The chart shows a massive decrease during the 1920s, which is probably caused by the World War I, and in which Germany was highly damaged, both socially and economy. Then the wealth equality, this measure is similar to the one before, but the difference is that the measure it measures the share of income of the top 1% of the population by comparing net worth instead of gross income. Regarding India, the graph only displays the following measures, as is overall income inequality, which is measured using the so-called Gini coefficient. And in the case of India, we see a negative trend in terms of Gini equivalized disposable household income, which rose from 47.2 in 2004 to 47.9 in 2011, meaning inequality rose in that period of time. Regarding the top income share, in this case we observed a positive trend from 1938 to 1981, and if we move onto income or consumption based on poverty measures, in this case we see a dramatic improvement in terms of inequality. The percentage of people under the poverty line has decreased from 45.9% to 27.5%.
Now we look at other methods of measuring inequality. Whilst income inequality is a great way to measure inequality, there are a number of other methods we can use to approach this. We'll focus in this report in two areas: health inequality and education inequality, focusing on gender. The first measure looks at mortality inequality by analyzing life expectancy of 10 different countries using a Gini coefficient based on the distribution of total years lived across people born in a given year. The data spans from 1952 to 2002, and the first trend to note is a general decrease in life expectancy inequality throughout the years. In 1952, the average coefficient was between all countries was 0.21, and in 2002, the average coefficient was 0.12. We also see important changes between countries. For example, Brazil, which in 1952 was the worst place in this ranking, sees its coefficient decrease from 0.42 to 0.18. India's also decreases from 0.4 to 0.22. And the rest of the countries also see decreases, but to a lower extent, which is reasonable considering that they already had lower coefficients in 1952. Although the general trend is clear and logical due to improvements worldwide in healthcare, sanitation, and lifestyle, there are countries that have managed to decrease mortality inequality more efficiently, especially those at the top. One example is Japan, which has increased by 5 positions, ending in second. Spain has also increased by 3 positions in the ranking, from 6th to 3rd. And one important reason for this general trend is the importance of robust public health systems, which are present in those countries at the top of the ranking. The bottom shows countries with weaker or less inclusive public systems, which is why there is more inequality in terms of health between its citizens. The second measure, which also ties into health inequality, is data regarding access to essential medicines. This metric aims to assess the percentage of the population that has access to generic medicines in the public service of a given country. Therefore, the lower the percentage, the less the access to these kinds of medicines, which negatively affects inequality. When analyzing the data, we can see that the countries with the higher medicine availability are Russia with 100%, Iran and Oman with 97%, and Syria with 93%, which is questionable because we know that these countries don't have the most stable or transparent governments. Taking Russia specifically, which states a 100% availability to medicine, we can conclude from this that Russia should have a very high level of health equality. If everyone has access to medicines, then everyone should have access to a good healthcare. However, as analyzed before, where we saw Russia has a higher life expectancy inequality than most of the other countries, we can infer that Russia is amongst the countries with a higher health inequality. This is just an example that illustrates why this is not a very reliable measure to analyze health inequality, as it provides misleading information that may not accurately capture the inequality in a country, as it is subject to manipulation from unreliable data sources. For the third measure, which now looks at gender inequality in education, we looked at the percentage of the female population in a country aged 15 to 19 with no education, with the data ranging from 1985 to 2010. We believe that this is an important metric as it is first of all, it's a proxy of education in a country in general, but also highlights social and economic development through the inclusion of women in the educational system and consequently in the labor force, which is a huge driver of economic development, as labor is logically such an important factor of production. In the analysis, we have chosen a range of countries at different stages of development, more developed countries and less developed countries. Look at the graph. Once again, we see a positive trend throughout, except in the Central African Republic, which has seen a slight increase over the past few years, but still in general has a decrease with respect to data from 1985. In the bottom of the chart, we see developed countries such as France, Canada, and Australia, which have practically no changes between both years in the data, because they already started from a very low point in 1985. And 3 other countries have seen huge improvements, these being UAE, Bangladesh, and Egypt, going from between 25 and 50% to practically 0% in 2010. Afghanistan, which has also seen improvements, still has, however, a very high proportion of uneducated females. The country with the biggest change is Bangladesh, as stated before, which has seen a decrease of 67% in its percentage of females aged 15 to 90 with no education since 1980. This is a magnificent decrease in inequality. The country with the smallest change is France, which with a decrease of less than 1%, but however, as noted before, they already had a very low percentage to begin with. The trend in the decrease in gender equality is thanks to numerous efforts that have been made around the world to promote equality and female inclusion in different aspects of society. It has been a combined effort which has involved societies, countries, and international organizations. The 2 countries that don't follow the trend, in this case Afghanistan and the Central African Republic, have other important external factors to consider in answering why this progress has not been made, which among others include religious and cultural factors, ongoing armed conflict, and low economic development.
So for the final remarks, we first started talking about the Lorenz curve from both Spain and France, and we saw that Spain income distribution has practically remained static for the last 30 years. On the other hand, France's income inequality has increased over the last years. Our solution would be to increase public spending and increase taxes on the richer people. Then we moved on and talked about the Gini coefficient, where we saw that both Spain and France have a Gini coefficient of over 0.4, meaning that there is adequate inequality in income. Thirdly, we talked about other economies, and of special relevance was that Germany's earning dispersion was very high, and that India's Gini coefficient was also high, meaning high inequality in income. Finally, we researched on health inequality and gender inequality, and we concluded that for health inequality, developing countries are improving, such as Brazil. Moreover, we saw that the main factor that affects health inequality in countries is the health system. Finally, for gender inequality, we saw that it's decreasing steadily over the world, taking the example of Bangladesh, but we still think there is room for improvement. So thank you very much.